Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 worker placement games. Now, the worker placement mechanism is one of the most popular mechanisms out there in the board game hobby today, and I must admit that it's one of my favorite mechanisms as well. Now, when preparing this list and ranking them from 10 to 1, I thought I would be a little cute with it and not rank games necessarily based on how much I like them, but instead by how impressed I am by how they implement the worker placement mechanism. So there are worker placement games that I love and adore even more than some of the games on this list that won't even make it to this ranking, because while I enjoy them overall as gaming experiences, the worker placement tends to be a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more basic and vanilla, and therefore I did not warrant placing them on this ranking. So without any further ado, let's move on to my number 10 worker placement game of all time, and that is Pillars of the Earth. And this here designed by Michael Renick and Stefan Stadler based on the popular novel by Ken Follett, the Pillars of the Earth novel. However, what players are doing is they're gathering resources throughout the game and contributing towards the process of converting those resources into efficient work, let's say. And you're using all these different workers. You have generic workers that you're going to use to send to the different fields to gather different resources of sand, stone, and wood. But then you have your master builder workers, and that's a different designation of workers that players have available to them. And these are your heavy hitters. They're going to take most of the important actions in your round. And all of the players put all of their master builders in a black bag. And then during the master builder phase, you blindly draw master builder workers from that bag one at a time. And the first person to have their master builder drawn is confronted with the tough decision. Do they want to place that master builder on one of the available worker placement spots and have to pay a price of 7 coins, or are they willing to pass, get bumped all the way to the back of the turn order, so that eventually when that worker does take their action, they'll take it for free. Then the next worker, after that person has passed, let's say, they get to make the choice of whether or not they want to place their worker, their master builder, at a price of 6, and then at a price of 5. And then eventually it gets to the point where when your master builder is drawn from the bag, the price becomes much more reasonable, and you'll only have to pay 4, 3, maybe even only 2 coins in order to take that action. And at that point, you're willing to pay that price. So that's something to consider. Sometimes those actions are so crucial, so important to you, that you might be willing to pay 7 coins because you're afraid that someone else around the table will beat you to the punch and take that action from you. This game plays really quickly as well. It's only 6 rounds, straightforward from game to game. And I love the beautiful board here designed by Michael Menzel, and the fact that this board is so intuitive. At first glance, it looks a little busy, but when you trigger the worker placement actions, once all players have actually placed their workers onto the board and to the corresponding spots, after that is done, then all of the actions will be triggered in clockwise order. So it's very intuitive in that sense. You never have to worry about which action gets triggered first than the other, because you simply need to know the way a clock moves. My number 10 worker placement game of all time, Pillars of the Earth. And now we move on to my number 9 worker placement game of all time, and that is Carson City. This is a Old West, Wild West city building theme game where players are working to build their sections of Carson City. There's no artwork here in the back. And the board basically consists of a grid of empty areas, empty parcels that players will be populating throughout the game with different things. And as the game progresses, players are going to be placing their houses and their buildings along the way. And if a player owns a piece of land, they can build a particular building there, and they can surround that building throughout the course of the game with houses and other features that will increase its value. Now, the cool thing here about the worker placement is, just like Pillars of the Earth, it's very intuitive because you have this track here corresponding to all the different worker placement spots, and it will get triggered in order of the track. So you'll make your way through the track, and that's how actions will be carried out. So when you're taking particular actions and making your choices, you got to factor in the order of things things because some of those worker placement actions may not be relevant anymore come time for them to be triggered. Also, the neat thing about this game is that to simulate that hectic Wild West environment, you have duels that take place. So if a player wants to, they can compete with you in a particular worker placement spot. Unlike many worker placement games where once a player occupies a certain spot, nobody else can occupy same spot. In this game, if you really want a spot bad enough, you can put a worker there and then you will partake in a duel. And that is a really neat aspect of the game where you'll compare your strength to that opponent's strength based on the different pistol tokens that you have in your possession and what have you. And the loser is going to have to leave that spot. But the benefit of the loser is that every worker that was humiliated in defeat, every cowboy that lost in a duel, goes back to their pool and is available for them in the next round. That's something really cool to factor in because in this game, the workers, the cowboys, they're consumable. So let's say you have 4 workers or 4 cowboys in round 1. Those are all spent. And then if you use all of them, you can choose to budget and save some of them for round 2. Then you replenish in each round. So at the start of round 2, let's say you'll get 4 or 5 additional cowboys to your pool. But you'll add that to whatever leftover remainder you had from the previous round. So if you were defeated in combat in a duel, the consolation prize is that at least that worker is not buried. They don't go away. They're going to go back to your pool and they'll at least be available for you next round. Not only that, but every cowboy in your pool also contributes to your cowboy's strength. So when you're factoring in duels, not only are you factoring in the amount of pistols you might have, but you're also factoring in how many cowboys you still have available to you in your reg. I love the spatial element of it all and trying to maneuver all this. But again, the worker placement between the intuitive nature of following the track and the fact that you have duels as an option of how to take a very coveted worker placement spot. Really neat. My number 9 worker placement game of all time, Carson City. And now we move on to my number 8. And my number 8 worker placement game of all time is The Lords of Waterdeep. And this is a Dungeons and Dragons themed worker placement game. And this game here is a great introduction into the worker placement genre and very basic in that regard. And I did mention earlier in my list that I try to avoid basic, straightforward worker placement games. But the cool thing about Lords of Waterdeep is that it has this very neat city building element that's taking place. You are literally growing the city of Waterdeep. The city of Waterdeep starts with a few basic locations that players can place their workers on to trigger said actions. However, from round to round, players are going to be partaking in the building of additional locations to grow and expand the city of Waterdeep and give further worker placement options to the players around the table. Now, the cool thing about when you build and grow Waterdeep in this game is that whoever contributes, whoever's the player who paid the cost, the money to build said location, that player is going to place an ownership token on that location, which means that location is technically theirs. And every time another player chooses to use that location for the benefit that that location provides, there's an additional bonus that it grants the owner for using that location. So you want to be involved in that city building process. You do not want to let your opponents do all of the city building because then you're going to have so many locations that you'll always help them in, but there's not going to be any locations that they can help you when they go to. So that's something really cool and really neat to factor in. The resources in this game represent different classes of adventurers such as rogues and clerics and wizards and fighters, but they're really just colored cubes that you use in order to complete objectives in the form of quest cards. Really cool, really neat. My number 8 worker placement game of all time, The Lords of Waterdeep. And now we move on to my number 7 worker placement game of all time, and that is Coal Baron by Michael Kiesling and Wolfgang Kramer. And this game here, if it was a little bit prettier, perhaps would be ranked a little higher because there's lots of things that I enjoy about this game. First of all, it plays very quickly. Second of all, it has this progressive scoring condition because the game is divided into 3 rounds, and as each round progresses, there's additional ways that you score. So in the first round here, you only score by having majorities or perhaps secondary amounts in the different types of coal that you produce. But by the time we score for the second round, then you're also going to score additional points for having the majorities in the different modes of transportation that you use to ship said coal. On top of that, you're still going to score for having the majorities and secondaries in each of the different types of coals that you sold. And finally, at the end of round 3, for each of your empty mines that you have of the different coal types, if you have the majority in those empty mines, again, you're going to score points. So by the time you make it to the end of the third round, you're scoring points in so many different ways. And from the very get-go, you're working towards that and you're building that. But as far as the worker placement is concerned, you have all these different sections on the board. And they all work a little bit differently as far as some of the things that they give you, the benefits that they grant you. But the cool thing about the worker placement is that if you go to an empty action, just like a typical worker placement game, you place one worker there and you trigger that action. However, in a future turn, you can go to that space again, whether you're blocking it or whether an opponent is blocking that space. You can choose to go to an occupied location. However, you have to play workers that are equal to the amount of workers currently in that location plus 1. In other words, if there's already a worker there, you need to place 2 workers there in order to activate that action. And as the round progresses, you might have to take an action in a location that already has 7 workers there. And you might have to spend 8 workers to take that action. And you have a limited supply, albeit a generous supply of workers at the start of each round. So that's something to factor in. Is 8 workers worth that action? Perhaps not. So you're mapping this all out as you're taking your decisions and trying to be as shrewd and as efficient as possible with your worker pool. Because again, you do have a generous yet limited supply, and you want to factor in all the other objectives that you're trying to accomplish for the current round. Really cool, really neat. My number 8 worker placement game of all time, Coal Baron. My number 6 worker placement game of all time is Kingsburg, designed by Andrea Cervesio and Luca Iannacco and published by Z-Man Games. Now, Kingsburg here is a worker placement game, dice placement game. That is, your workers are actually represented by dice, where the board consists of a grid of all these different royal court officials. And basically, they're ranked from 1 through 18, the king being the highest and the court jester being the lowest. And these numbers that are associated to them correspond with the amount of dice value that you must contribute to trigger these worker placement spots. And at the beginning of each round, players are rolling their dice, determining their numbers, and based on those numbers, they can trigger certain worker placement actions. Now, you can choose to separate and divide your dice to use as many and occupy as many worker placement spots as possible, although they will be lower numbered, or you can lump them up together, 2 or even 3 dice at a time to gain larger totals and influence some of these higher ranked court officials. Now, the cool thing about this game is that as you roll the dice at the beginning of the turn, you can see around the table the dice that the other players have rolled, that your opponents have rolled, and you can take that into consideration when making your decisions, because you may not necessarily want to go to the worker placement spots that your opponents cannot possibly interfere with. Perhaps you're going to want to prioritize and see where you will go based on what they can do, what they can interfere with. Because if your opponent can block you in a particular action that you really want to do, then you should probably go and take care of that action first and save those other actions that are not in jeopardy of being interfered with for later on in the course of that same round. Now, there's some really cool city building that's taking place where players are progressively building their section of Kingsburg. And as they add these additional buildings, these buildings grant additional abilities, strengths, and bonuses to the players who build them. And among those are some modifications, some ways of dice mitigation. So you can add to your rolls or subtract to your rolls, even to your convenience. And that allows to mitigate the dice roll, because it could be very frustrating when you are limited by terrible or unfortunate dice rolling in your worker placement options. But I really like the concept of dice placement, and I like the way it's implemented here in Kingsburg. My number 6 worker placement game of all time Kingsburg. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop, my 5 favorite worker placement games, at least from a worker placement perspective. And my number 5 is Rise to Nobility. And this is a game that gets no love and no regard. This game here is another dice placement game, just like Kingsburg. And although I think I enjoy Kingsburg more overall as a game, because I'm a really big fan of the city building that takes place in Kingsburg, and in particular the grid that players are working through in order to progressively grow their section of the city, Rise to Nobility, the dice placement is a little bit more interesting in this game. First of all, you have the board, which consists of a bunch of different sections. There is a little bit of city building taking place here as players are growing the different guilds and their sections of the board. However, there's a bunch of other spots that players need to account for on the map or on the board here. And what's interesting about this is that each of these locations have a different way of operating as far as the worker placement is concerned. For some of these locations, you have to spend specific numbers of dice. Let's say a 3 or a 4. For some of these locations, you can place any dice, but in subsequent turns on that same round, any other player who wants to go to that location, including yourself, is going to have to play a die that has a pip value equal to or higher than the one already placed. In some other locations, you're going to have to place a die, whatever die you want, but going forward, players are going to have to place dice that are equal to or lower in pip value than the dice that was first placed in that location. So you're managing all these different dice and deciding where's the best place to go based on not only the actions that you want to trigger, but how these particular locations work as far as the dice placement is concerned. Now, what's really cool about this game is that players have this stat at the beginning of the game. It's called their prestige or their privilege, or I forgot what's the exact term. But as the game progresses, you're going to want to increase that because your prestige basically determines the cap amount that your combined dice can have when you place dice. So you roll 5 dice at the beginning of each round no matter what. But if your prestige value is 15, let's say, then the amount of dice that you actually place on that board on that current round cannot exceed a pip value of 15. It has to be 15 or lower for it to be effective. So you want to keep on taking certain actions that increase your prestige because you want in the future to be able to capitalize and use as many of your dice as possible on a given round. My number 5 worker placement game of all time, the Rise to Nobility. My number 4 worker placement game of all time is Marco Polo, designed by Daniel Tascini and Simone Luciani and published again by Z-Man Games. And this is yet another dice placement game. I have 3 games in a row that are dice placement games, and I enjoy this style of worker placement, the mitigation of the dice and using them in creative ways to carry out these worker placement actions. Now, the cool thing about this game here, it has no city building, unlike Rise to Nobility and Kingsburg. You are traveling through cities as you progress your way through the Silk Road, making it to the easternmost parts of Asia, all the way from the Mediterranean. Along the way, you're establishing markets and gaining privileges from said locations. But the cool thing here, as far as the dice placement is concerned, is you have a bunch of these different types of worker placement actions that you can take. And in some of these locations, the amount of times you can trigger the action corresponds with the pip value of the dice you place to trigger that action. So in some cases, if you put a dice that has a pip value of 3, that means you're going to be able to carry out that action 3 times. If you put a dice that has 6 pip value, then that means, if possible, you'll be able to carry out that action 6 times. Now, what's really cool is there's some spots here that are blockable, and there are other spots that are not blockable. There's spots that a player can choose to take even if another player took it before them. Now, there is a price to pay, however. You need to pay equal to the amount of the lowest dice that you place there. So for some of these actions, you're going to place dice on top of a previous opponent's dice, and you're going to look at the 2 dice that let's say you rolled a 4 and a 2, and if you place that 4 and a 2 on top of that other player's action, you're going to have to pay 2 coins to carry out that action, because that 2 corresponds with the lowest pip value of the dice that you place there. So that's something to consider. So there are situations where rolling very low numbers can be very useful and very positive for the player, because that means that they'll have to pay less coins in order to trigger that action. The worker placement works really neat. The dice placement, again, I like the fact that the pip values matter for a different reason. Not only where you can go, but how much you pay if you choose to go to an already occupied spot, and also how many times you can trigger specific actions. My number 4 worker placement game of all time, Marco Polo. My number 3 worker placement game of all time is Village, designed by Inca and Marcus Brand and published here by Stronghold Games. And Village here is probably the most unique out of all these worker placement games that I've chosen for this list, and perhaps people might not even see it as a worker placement game because of that. In Village, first of all, each round you're gonna populate all the different worker placement spots with these colored cubes, and these colored cubes represent different aspects of medieval civilization, things that you're gonna use as a currency throughout the game to trigger future actions and gain additional benefits. But every time you go to a particular spot on the board, instead of placing a worker down, you're going to pick up one of these cubes to indicate that you're taking the action in that spot. And there's a limited amount of cubes based on the different spots on the board. So once a spot no longer has any cubes, that means that spot's action can no longer be taken for that given round. And that's one of the really cool things in this game. You have generations of workers. You start with your first generation workers, and in your pool you have your second, third, and fourth generation workers, which eventually will be added to your farm board and will be available to you. But as the game progresses, your older generations are aging and they're dying off. And what you want to accomplish in this game is you want them to die at the right time so that they can be registered here in the Chronicle. Because your characters here that are registered in the Chronicle are going to gain you prestige and victory points at the end of the game. Whoever does not have room to be mentioned in the Chronicle upon death will simply be buried in these anonymous graveyard area here. And they're not going to have no honor, and they're going to have no victory point contribution towards your endgame score. So that's really cool, because every action, or most of the actions you take, actually progress you in this time track that you have along your farm board. And every time you cross a certain threshold on that time track, you are obligated to kill one of your characters, one of your workers from your oldest existing village, your oldest existing generation. So that's really tough, because sometimes you're going to have to take a worker that's contributing to you somewhere. Perhaps they're going on a journey through different cities, or they're producing resources for you here in the crafting area, or perhaps they're ascending in their career in church, in the religion, or perhaps they're ascending in their career in politics. Whatever it might be, sometimes you're going to be forced and confronted with these really tough decisions of killing off these workers. But it's all about managing the situation and mapping out and timing the death, the timely demise of all of these different workers, so that they can contribute to your scoring here on the Chronicle. But you also want to advance as much as possible with the workers that you do place on the board. You want to travel and visit as many cities as possible with your little pilgrim here. You want to ascend in your career in the monastery as much as possible, and in the Senate or in the council, you want to grow as much as possible as well. It's so cool that each spot has a predetermined amount of communal actions that you can take. So at the beginning of the round, you know that collectively only 3 actions can be taken in this location. So how many of those actions are going to be mine? Maybe I want 2 of those to be mine, and only 1 will be my opponent's, or what have you. And you're factoring all that stuff in. I like the artwork. I like the way that all the mechanisms gel together. I like the uniqueness of adding additional future generations of workers and burying past generations, and hopefully making them have some meaning and purpose in their life before they die, in order for them to accrue victory points for you at the end of the game. My number 3 worker placement game of all time, Village. My number 2 worker placement game of all time is Viniculture, designed by Jamie Stegmaier and Alan Stone, and published by Stonemaier Games. And this here is the flagship, the pioneer of their publishing company here. And Viniculture is the strategic game of winemaking. And basically, players are running their vineyards. They're planting different types of vineyards that produce different types of grapes, whether it be red grapes or green grapes. And they are harvesting said grapes and turning those grapes into wine in order to fulfill different wine orders or contracts for money and for victory points. This game features 4 different phases of the year for each round. You have your spring, your summer, your fall, and your winter phase. 2 of those phases are your worker placement phases, and 2 of them are just basically setup and additional card drafting that takes place. Now, for your worker placement phases, which are your summer and your winter phases, you're taking 2 different types of actions. However, they all mesh into one giant round. So you gotta budget your workers accordingly, because once you place down all your workers, let's say, during the summer phase of the round, then you're gonna have no workers available for you during the winter phase of the round. And the summer sets you up for the winter, so you wanna find the right balance between it all. Also, this game is one of those games that starts with a small pool of workers available to the players, and as the game progresses, they can train workers. They can pay money to train workers and add additional workers to their supply so that they can trigger more worker placement options in future rounds. So that's something to consider. I love it when games allow for you to gradually, progressively intensify your turns and your actions by gaining additional resources, and in this case, in the form of workers. It's really, really cool. I like the fact that it features a grande worker, and the grande basically lets you break the typical rule of worker placement, which is once a player occupies a spot, that place is blocked and you cannot go there. If you want to, you have one worker among your pool of workers, your grande, who you can place in any already occupied location. So you really want to time the usage of the grande wisely. Now, the grande could simply be used as a regular worker, and you can place him in a place that's already that is empty, that has not been occupied. But primarily, ideally, you want to save your grande for later on in the round when you really want to trigger an action, but that action is already blocked by an opponent. Really cool, really neat. I like the thematic integration of this game. I really do feel like I'm running a vineyard. And again, I like that progressive increase of the workers and what they can do for you, and the ebb and flow in the game, where by the time you make it to the later parts of the game, you are producing this wine and you are fulfilling these contracts and you're really scoring points. It starts off very slow, but it really picks up and intensifies towards the end of the game. My number 2 worker placement game of all time, Viniculture. And now we move on to my number 1 worker placement game of all time. My number 1 for worker placement is Raiders of the North Sea by Shem Phillips. And this game here, first of all, besides the beautiful artwork, I love the artwork here from Garfield Games. I love the presentation of the board and the different cards and the different Viking characters that you'll find on these cards. I just love the worker placement in this game. It's such a neat mechanism. Each round, players are going to place down a worker onto the board, and then they're going to pick up another worker on the board. And basically, both of those actions will trigger an action. So every time you place a worker on an empty spot, you're going to trigger that spot's action. And every time you pick up a worker from an occupied spot, you're going to trigger that action, that location's action. And not only that, but that worker that you picked up is setting yourself up for your next turn, because there's 3 different types of workers or Vikings in this game. You have your black, your gray, and your white Viking meeples. And each of these have different values as far as the specific actions they can take. As a matter of fact, there's some actions that the white, more powerful Vikings cannot take. Yet at the same time, there's lots of actions that the black, weaker Vikings cannot take. And you got to factor that all in, because you might pick up a worker as your second half of your action, but you might have not picked up the right worker to set yourself up for the next round. And all of a sudden, you confront it with your next round. You're like, oops, I made a mistake. because you simply picked up a black worker because you really liked the action it triggered. But for the next round, you really needed a white worker in order to activate the action that you wanted to do. And there's two types of general things you're doing. You're going to the town and village, and this is basically the upkeep and the maintenance of the game that you're using to recruit crew members, which come in the form of cards, to acquire different resources that you're going to need, like supply, like coins, like ore and such. And then the other action you take is raids. You are a raider of the North Sea. So you're going to be going on different raids, and you raid the harbors, and you raid the outposts, and you raid the fortresses and the monasteries. And each of these different locations are going to give you victory points accordingly when you successfully raid them. But they also have a requirement, a particular size of crew members you're going to need, and a particular amount of supply or other resources you're going to need in order to successfully raid these locations for their plunder. And it's really cool because all the different resources you gather, you're going to be able to turn into the chieftain as an offering, and that's going to score you victory points. Along the way, you're going to have different pieces in some of these raid locations. These black pieces are referred to as the Valkyrie. And every time you have a Valkyrie in a location you raid, you are going to have to sacrifice one of your crew members. They're going to die, go to Valhalla, and they will no longer be available for you for the rest of the game. I love the Norse theme. I love the artwork, but again, I love the neat, simple, yet deep mechanism of putting a worker down, triggering its action, and picking up another worker and triggering that action, all the while anticipating your upcoming turn and knowing exactly what type of worker you want and or need for your future rounds. Really cool, really exciting. My number one worker placement game of all time, Raiders of the North Sea. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here When Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below. Tell me what's your favorite worker placement game of all time. What did you think about the games on my list? I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.